It all began on a rainy Thursday night, when the city lights flickered through the tall glass walls of the Crawford estate. The mansion stood silent, except for the sound of the rain drumming softly against the marble terrace. Inside, servants hurried quietly through the hallways, careful not to disturb the man who ruled the house with cold precision, Alexander Crawford, a billionaire known for his steel-gray eyes and a heart that, most believed, had long forgotten how to feel. Alexander's life was built on control. Every minute of his day, every word he spoke, every breath he took, all calculated. His empire stretched across continents, his reputation unshakable. But behind the power and money lay a man haunted by memories he refused to revisit. He had lost his wife 5 years ago in a tragic accident, and since then, the walls of his heart had turned to stone. The mansion became a museum of his solitude, filled with luxury but devoid of warmth. Among the staff who served him, there was one face he could never quite ignore, a maid named Alara. She had been hired only 6 months ago, but she carried herself differently than the others. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, and graceful, and her eyes, soft brown but always distant, held a sadness he couldn't name. She never looked him in the eye, never spoke unless spoken to, and yet something about her made it impossible for him not to notice. It began with small things. Once, he caught her standing by the grand piano late at night, tracing her fingers across the ivory keys as if remembering a forgotten melody. Another time, she was outside in the rain, helping a stray kitten, her uniform soaked but her face gentle with care. Alexander never said a word about it, but each of these moments stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. One evening, while reviewing financial reports in his study, his guard, Mason, entered quietly. "Sir," he began, "I thought you should know. The maid, Alara, has been leaving the property every night after her shift." Alexander didn't look up at first. "And she's been careful about it," Mason continued. "Takes the back road, avoids the cameras. I thought you might want to know." For the first time in a long while, Alexander's pen stopped moving. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "Follow her," he said after a moment. "Find out where she goes. But don't let her see you." Mason nodded. "Yes, sir." That night, while the storm rolled across the horizon, Mason followed Alara at a distance. She walked quickly through the misty streets, her umbrella barely keeping her dry. The rain soaked through her dress, but she didn't seem to care. She took a narrow path toward the outskirts of town, where the bright lights faded into darkness. After nearly 30 minutes of walking, she turned down an old alley and stopped at a crumbling building. The sign above the door was broken, the letters barely visible, an abandoned shelter that had closed years ago. Mason watched as she slipped inside, carrying a small bag she had taken from the servants' quarters earlier that evening. Peering through a broken window, Mason saw her kneel beside a group of people huddled in the corner, a woman, 2 small children, and an old man. They looked weak, hungry, desperate. Alara reached into her bag and began pulling out food, bread, fruit, bottles of water. She handed them out one by one, her hands trembling slightly. Then she removed her coat and placed it over one of the children, whispering something that Mason couldn't hear through the rain. When she finally stood, she wiped her face and looked around the dark shelter, her expression filled with pain and resolve. Then she knelt again and began cleaning wounds on the old man's arm using pieces of cloth she had brought with her. Mason could hardly believe what he was seeing. The next morning, when he returned to the mansion, Alexander was already awake, standing by the window with a cup of black coffee. Without turning, he asked, "Did you find out where she goes?" "Yes, sir," Mason said quietly. "But I don't think she's doing anything wrong." Alexander turned to face him. "Explain." Mason hesitated. "She goes to an old shelter in the industrial district. There are people there, a family, I think. She's been bringing them food, medicine, blankets. Looks like she's been doing it for a while." Alexander's jaw tightened. "A shelter?" "Yes, sir. Abandoned one. She's helping them survive. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Alexander spoke again, his voice low but firm. Keep watching. I want to know everything. Who they are, why she's doing this, and how she's getting the money. Mason wanted to argue, but he knew better. Understood, sir. That evening, Alexander found himself distracted. He tried to work, but his thoughts kept returning to the maid who spent her nights feeding strangers. He didn't understand why she would risk her job, and possibly her safety, for people she barely knew. And more than that, he didn't understand why he cared. At dinner, Alara served him as usual, her expression calm, her movements practiced. But when their eyes met for the briefest second, something inside him shifted. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the small cuts on her hands, and the way she moved slightly slower than usual. Are you feeling unwell? He asked suddenly. Her hands froze on the silver tray. No, sir, I'm fine. You look tired. I just didn't sleep much. He wanted to ask more, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he gave a curt nod and returned to his meal, though he didn't take another bite. Later that night, Mason reported again. Sir, I followed her as you asked. Same place. She stayed for almost 2 hours. She's helping them fix the roof now, using supplies she must have bought herself. Alexander frowned. Bought? With what money? Mason hesitated. She's been skipping her own meals here, giving away her food portions. I think she's using what little salary she has to buy supplies for them. For a long time, Alexander said nothing. Then he walked to the window, looking out at the moonlight glimmering over the city skyline. He had seen greed, manipulation, and selfishness in every form, in business, in love, in family. But this quiet selflessness unsettled him. The next morning, he called for her. Alara entered his office nervously, her eyes cast downward. You've been working here for 6 months, he began. Are you satisfied with your position? Yes, sir, I'm grateful for it. Good, he said, watching her closely. Because I expect honesty and loyalty from all my employees. She nodded, still not meeting his gaze. Where do you go at night, Alara? He asked suddenly, her breath caught. I don't understand, sir. Don't lie to me. His voice was calm but sharp. My guard has been following you. I know you leave the property. I want the truth. For a long moment, she stood frozen. Then her shoulders sagged. I go to help some people, sir, she whispered. They have nowhere else to go. People, a woman and her children, and an old man. They were living in the shelter when I found them. I couldn't just walk away. Alexander leaned forward. Do you realize that leaving the estate without permission violates your contract? I know, sir, she said softly, her eyes glistening. If you want to dismiss me, I understand. But they would starve without help. He stared at her in silence. Every part of him wanted to reprimand her, to remind her of rules, hierarchy, discipline. But something in her voice, the quiet conviction, stopped him. Who are they? He asked finally. They're just people who lost everything, she said. The woman's husband died last year. The old man used to work at your factory before it shut down. They're not beggars, sir. They just need a chance. He said nothing. The room felt heavy with the weight of unspoken things. After she left, Alexander couldn't shake her words. The image of that broken shelter haunted him. That night, for reasons he couldn't explain, he took his car and drove to the address Mason had given him. He parked a block away and walked through the cold wind until he reached the abandoned building. Peering through the doorway, he saw exactly what Mason had described. The broken walls, the flickering candles, the frail figures huddled together. And then he saw her. Alara was kneeling beside the little girl, teaching her how to write letters on a scrap of paper. Her voice was soft, full of warmth that had long been absent from his world. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something stir deep within him, a strange ache, a recognition of humanity he thought he had lost. He left before she could see him. The next morning, He called Mason. "Find out everything about that family," he ordered. "Names, history, everything." By afternoon, Mason returned with a file. "The woman's name is Clara. Her husband died in a factory accident 2 years ago. It was one of yours, sir, Crawford Steelworks." Alexander froze. "My factory?" "Yes. There was a machinery fault." The case was settled quietly. The man was supposed to receive compensation, but Mason hesitated. He never did. "The paperwork was mishandled by your old manager." For the first time, Alexander felt guilt twist inside him. He had built his empire on efficiency and power, but in his pursuit of success, he had overlooked the people crushed beneath his wealth. That evening, he summoned Alara again. "You knew who they were," he said. "Yes, sir," she admitted. "The woman came to the estate once, begging for help. She was turned away. I couldn't forget her face." "Why didn't you tell me?" She met his eyes for the first time. "Because I didn't think you would care." The words cut deeper than she could have imagined. Alexander said nothing for a long while. Then he rose from his chair, walked to the window, and spoke quietly. "You were wrong." The next morning, construction trucks arrived at the shelter. Workers began repairing the roof, installing windows, cleaning the grounds. The family watched in disbelief as supplies poured in. Alara arrived later, stunned to see the change. Alexander was there, standing beside his car, dressed in his usual black coat. When she approached, speechless, he said only, "If you're going to help them, you shouldn't have to do it alone." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's time I fixed what I broke," he said simply. "And because someone reminded me what compassion looks like." In the following weeks, the shelter transformed. Alexander funded its restoration completely, turning it into a fully functional community center. He hired doctors, teachers, and social workers, and he made Alara the coordinator, giving her the authority to manage the program. But what shocked him most wasn't her gratitude. It was how natural it felt to see her smile. For the first time since his wife's death, the mansion didn't feel empty anymore. Sometimes, he still found her standing by the piano late at night, playing softly. And though she never said it aloud, he could feel that the music she played was no longer filled with sorrow, but with hope, a melody that reminded him that even the coldest hearts could be warmed again. And somewhere deep inside, Alexander Crawford realized that the maid he had once suspected had quietly taught him the one lesson he had long forgotten, that love and kindness could rebuild what money never could.